Have you ever noticed that the strongest and most grounded people you've met are often the ones who chose to walk alone? Not because they were abandoned, not because they were broken or lonely, but because, at some point, they discovered a truth most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Peace is more precious than being surrounded. Solitude is not a punishment, it's a layer of protection. Silence is not empty, it's sacred. The truth is, most of us are not afraid of being alone. We're afraid of facing ourselves in the stillness. When the applause fades, when there's no one left to blame, all that's left is user choices, our patterns, our untouched truths. I used to fear that too. I thought connection meant someone always had to be there. But then I learned something. There is a kind of strength that only rises when no one stays. When you stop performing, when you stop asking, who sees me, and start declaring, I see myself. This is not isolation. This is freedom. And if the stillness is calling you, do not ignore it. It is not loneliness. It is your soul whispering, it's time to come home. And now, let's talk about the miracle that begins the moment you stop running and start truly becoming who you were always meant to be. I used to think walking alone was a sign of loss, that only those who were unloved lived in solitude. But I was wrong, deeply wrong, because then I realized there are people who were never abandoned, who were never lacking love, yet they still chose to step away from the crowd, to leave behind half-hearted conversations, to separate from relationships that no longer allowed them to be themselves simply because they were full. Full enough to know that not every connection is worth keeping. Calm enough to look at their life and ask, is this presence nourishing me or is it making me lose myself? They chose to be alone, not because no one chose them, but because they chose themselves first. That is not arrogance. That is awareness. It's when you begin to see that some relationships, even if they seem fine, are quietly draining you. It's when you recognize that you've been trading peace for presence, just to not feel empty. But in the end, you're still empty. Not because you lacked people, but because you lost yourself. And then one day, they stop. They step away. No drama, no blame, no anger, just a quiet but firm decision. I don't need to be here anymore. I deserve a space where I don't have to shrink to fit into someone else's world. It sounds simple, but it takes a rare kind of courage. Because walking alone also means giving up old habits, giving up the comfort of having someone, even if it's the wrong one. No more small talk when you're bored. No more texts that say, are you home yet? But in return, they gain something that social busyness could never offer. Clarity. Clarity about their worth. Clarity about the boundaries they need. Clarity that not everyone has the right to stay in your life just because they're familiar. And most importantly, they realize that presence doesn't always mean connection. Some people stand next to you every day and never really see you. And some moments alone allow you to see yourself more clearly than ever before. I remember the first time I walked away from a relationship that seemed normal. There was no big drama, no deep pain, just one undeniable truth. I was no longer myself. And I knew that if I stayed, I would lose the most valuable thing, not the other person, but the quiet self-respect within me. People who choose to live alone are not doing so because they have no one to be with. They do it because they understand that no one should be in your life at the cost of your soul. If a connection makes you lose yourself, it's not a connection, it's a sugar-coated chain. And once you've experienced the feeling of being fully yourself in a space you created on your own, you won't easily trade it for the fear of emptiness, because by then you are no longer empty. You are full. Full of awareness, full of self-respect, full of energy, no longer drained by halfway presences. You don't have to be cold or closed off to live alone. You just need to respect yourself enough not to settle for less than what your soul truly deserves. And that is where this journey truly begins. When you begin to live alone, the first thing that hits you is not loneliness, but silence. A complete silence, with no voices, no messages, no half-hearted check-ins. And for many, it feels like emptiness. But for those patient enough to stay, it becomes an irreplaceable source of power. Silence at first feels confusing. It's not the kind of sound you're used to. There's no noise to distract you, no social laughter to cover emotions. It's just you, with everything you've never dealt with. And if you dare to sit with it long enough, you'll discover something. Silence is not a void, it's a space to hear yourself. I used to be uncomfortable with silence. In those early nights living alone, I played instrumental music just to avoid the feeling of emptiness. But one day, I turned everything off. No speakers, no television, no notifications, just the ticking clock, my own breath, and one very clear question echoing in my head. What am I truly living for? It was in that stillness that I finally heard the voice within me, the voice that had been buried under the noise of others. The times I pretended to be fine, to keep the peace, the times I nodded in agreement, just to not be left out. All of that gone. No one to please now. And when there's no one left to perform for, you come face to face with the one person you've avoided the most, yourself. Silence helps you see what's really draining you. It shows you that it's not the workload that's too much, it's the pressure to always appear strong. It's not that you lack love, it's that you're in a relationship where love isn't given the right way. Silence doesn't accuse you, it shines a light on what you've ignored for too long. And the strange thing is, the longer you stay in silence, the stronger you become. You stop reacting to everything. You begin to know when to respond and when to hold back. You no longer feel the need to explain every decision, to prove your worth to anyone. You start doing something incredibly simple yet powerful. You practice intentional silence. Silence is no longer the awkward space between two people with nothing to say. It becomes a sacred pause to protect your energy. It teaches you that not every attack needs a reaction. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not every situation needs a speech, because peace does not require negotiation. And when you live long enough in that kind of intentional silence, you begin to realize truth doesn't need to shout. Depth doesn't need to perform. And real power is not in the volume of your voice, but in your ability to choose when to use it. You start to move by intuition. You eat when you're hungry, rest when you're tired, and work not because of deadlines, but because of purpose. You don't need approval for your schedule, your decisions, or your dreams. You only need agreement from yourself. And that is what makes you dangerous in the most beautiful way, because you are no longer easily controlled by the need to be accepted. So what about you? When was the last time you sat in silence and weren't afraid of it? Share a moment when stillness touched you. Comment below. And if this message resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue this journey together. One of the biggest transformations on the journey of living alone is the moment you stop needing others to understand you in order to feel valid. You no longer walk in circles explaining every decision, no longer repeat the same story hoping someone will finally listen all the way through. Instead, you begin to realize something deeply important. True freedom doesn't come from being understood. It comes from no longer needing it to live in alignment with yourself. Maybe in the past you tried to express your feelings, beliefs, and dreams as clearly as possible. You wanted someone to understand why you chose a different path, why you said no to what looked safe, why you no longer fit in a relationship that once seemed steady. And then all you got was a confused look or a silence that stung. You started to wonder, is something wrong with me? But eventually you discovered the only mistake was believing you needed to be understood in order to be real. The truth is, most people don't listen to understand. They listen to respond. They don't care where you've been, what you've survived, or how deep your questions run. They only care if you match their expectations. And if you don't, they label you too different, too quiet, too cold, too hard to figure out. What they don't know is that sometimes silence doesn't mean you don't know what to say. It means you're too tired to keep proving yourself. And in that moment, you let go, not of yourself, but of the need to be validated. You let go of needing to be right in someone else's eyes. You let go of the belief that you need someone's agreement to live a meaningful life. And from that moment, a new door opens. A new space, a peer zone where you are free to be real, untouched by the pressure of other people's expectations. When you stop having to explain every decision, you live lighter. When you no longer need someone to understand why you choose stillness over noise, discipline over ease, depth over popularity, you begin to reclaim all the energy you once wasted trying to explain yourself. You no longer ask for permission to be who you are. Freedom is standing in front of a decision and not needing anyone's nod to move forward. Freedom is sleeping peacefully at night, even if no one gets you, because you get yourself. Freedom is no longer reacting to judgment. You just observe, smile, and keep going. Because you know, the truth doesn't need to be believed to be true. It only needs to be lived. And then something beautiful happens. You begin to attract people who don't need you to explain everything. They feel your energy not because you're convincing, but because you're consistent. They respect the space you protect, not because you demand it, but because you live with non-negotiable self-respect. And if no one comes, that's okay, because you no longer live to be seen. You live because you know you're on the right path. The need to be understood is an invisible burden. It makes you speak too carefully, live too cautiously, behave by someone else's script. But when you release it, you stop living inside a box. You act from what is right, not what is easy. You speak what needs to be said, not what gets applause. And you stay silent, not because you're weak, but because you have nothing to prove. That is where true freedom begins. Not when you are recognized, but when you stop needing recognition. Not when someone finally sees you clearly, but when you are clear within yourself. And once you've tasted that kind of freedom, you will never again accept being a prisoner inside someone else's perception. Something powerful begins to happen. The moment you stop reshaping yourself to fit others, you start to bloom. No more forcing, no more control, no more suppressing the unusual parts of you just to blend in. You stop asking, what will they think, before you speak. You no longer distort your emotions just to maintain a connection that no longer feels real. And in that letting go, the creative energy you thought was gone begins to return. Nothing suffocates your inner power faster than living in defense mode. When you constantly measure every word, second guess every move, and hide your truest thoughts just to keep the peace or avoid judgment, you begin to disconnect from the most alive and creative part of you. You stop living proactively. You become a manager of other people's emotions instead of the leader of your own life. But when you live alone with no one watching, no one waiting for you to be agreeable, no one needing your explanations, you finally get to ask, how would I live if no one expected me to be like them? And from that question, a new current begins to flow. You write down the ideas you once suppressed. You try the things you've always wanted to, but never dared. You begin to design your space not to impress, but to nourish. You're no longer adjusting for anyone. Now you're redesigning yourself. You wake up at 5 a.m., not to prove your discipline, but because the stillness of that hour brings clarity to your mind. You might meditate at noon or walk under the moonlight at midnight, not because it's eccentric, but because it aligns with your rhythm and your soul. You stop asking for permission. You stop postponing. You begin to create, not just survive. Creativity isn't just writing, painting, or inventing. Creativity is your ability to respond to life with awareness. It's cooking a meal without a recipe because you trust your taste. It's wearing what makes you feel confident, not what's trending. It's doing work that seems ordinary but is full of presence because you're no longer distracted by trying to do it right in someone else's eyes. And the deepest truth is, this creativity cannot thrive in a space where you are constantly being judged. It needs breathing room, it needs safety, it needs you to be fully yourself without fear of being trimmed down. And when you live alone, you create that environment where you don't need permission to be real, where you are the sole keeper of your joy and your sorrow. You no longer chase after others asking, what should I do next? Now you ask yourself, what do I want to build today? And in that shift from asking for direction to creating your own, something powerful awakens in you the ability to become the creator of your own life. No more blaming, no more repeating old scripts, no more waiting for someone to agree. That's when you realize you don't need to change the world overnight. but you absolutely can change the inner space you live in. And from there, everything outside begins to shift. We often think clarity comes from the outside, from a conversation, a piece of advice, or a turning point in life. But then there are times when you try everything. You ask for opinions, read books, listen to podcasts, talk to all the right people, and you still find yourself right back where you started, uncertain, lost, confused. It's only when all that noise stops that you begin to see what was truly needed stillness. And from that, clarity begins to rise. Not the kind of clarity others draw for you, but the kind that comes from within, simple, sharp, unquestionable. It doesn't shout. It doesn't show off. But once you feel it, you can no longer pretend you don't know. That is the moment you stop searching for answers in the world and start trusting the intuition you've been silencing for too long. When you live alone, without meaningless conversations, without social gatherings out of politeness, without having to update someone about your life every day, you begin to create space for real thinking. And you realize you don't need more data. You need less noise. You don't need more advice. You need silence. So you can finally hear the voice inside you that was drowned out by expectation and fear. Clarity doesn't come when you rush to find it. It comes when you're brave enough to stop, to sit in a room with no voices, no phone, and no urge to do something just to feel worthy. You sit not to escape, but to connect. And then the things that once felt tangled in your mind begin to fall into place, not because of luck, but because you've finally become still enough. And here's the most important truth: clarity is often very quiet. It doesn't scream, doesn't pressure you, it doesn't ask for applause. It simply waits in the deepest corner of your being for you to become still enough to notice it. Like light breaking through dust, it's only when you stop stirring the water that you can see the bottom. I used to live in a constant fog thinking I lacked direction or purpose. But then I realized it wasn't that I didn't have a path. I had just never allowed my life to be quiet long enough to know where I truly wanted to go. I kept running, changing directions, switching jobs, replacing people, and still felt a hole I couldn't name. It wasn't until I stopped, cut the noise, and sat with myself. No distraction, no explanation, that clarity finally came. Because clarity doesn't come from motion, it comes from stillness. And once you've lived in that kind of clarity, you're no longer easily pulled into chaos. Half-hearted conversations, blurry relationships, fake ambitions, they suddenly feel too loud. Not because you hate them, but because you've come to know what peace sounds like. And once you've known peace, you don't want to trade it for artificial noise again. Clarity doesn't make you cold. It makes you focused. You stop reacting, you start responding. You stop doing things just because you should. You do them because you know where they lead. And when you say no, you don't feel guilty because you know exactly what you're protecting behind that refusal. Clarity is the greatest gift silence has to offer. It doesn't come when you beg for it. It comes when you are courageous enough to face yourself, no defense, no excuse. And in that moment, you stop living like a leaf blown by the wind. You stand firm, not because you know everything, but because for the first time in a long time, you've truly heard yourself. One day, you will wake up and realize you don't need applause anymore. You don't need praise to believe in what you're doing. You don't need recognition to feel your life has value. And in that very moment, you begin to live authentically. Most of us grow up with the belief, do well to be praised. From school to the workplace, from family to social media, we're taught how to be likable, agreeable, easy to love. But in becoming easy, we slowly lose ourselves. Every time we cut off a piece of our personality to keep the peace, every time we stay silent when we should have spoken up, every time we pretend to be fine just to avoid making someone uncomfortable, we trade truth for acceptance. And before long, we live like a programmed copy instead of a human being with a vivid, clear, and original inner world. Applause is addictive. It makes you feel seen, validated. But if you live off it for too long, you forget what it feels like to stand on your own. Because when the applause fades, you start wondering, did I do something wrong? And so you perform again. You polish again. You hide the exhaustion just to keep the crowd clapping. But the truth is, the crowd doesn't know you. They only know the version you performed. And at some point, you have to keep chasing that hollow validation, or give it all up to find your way back to yourself, even if that path has no cheering audience. When you live alone, all that noise begins to fade. No one texts to check how you're doing. No one is there to hear your daily wins. No one is surprised or disappointed if you change direction. And in that absence, you finally get to ask a simple but life-changing question. If no one knew about this, would I still want to do it? If no one praised you, took a photo, or gave recognition, would you still live this way? That is the test of true value. And if your answer is yes, then you've just stepped into a new level of life lived from within, not for applause from the outside. Living authentically is not flashy. It doesn't impress right away, but it builds a deep, steady kind of power where you keep moving without applause, keep showing up without support, keep shining without being seen. Authentic people know this well. Validation doesn't nourish the soul. It's seasoning, not sustenance. If you live on it, you'll always chase the crowd, change directions constantly, and never feel enough. But when you live from inner values, you don't chase, you build. You don't seek the spotlight, you become the light. And the most beautiful part? People who live authentically are not afraid of being misunderstood. They know being understood is not as important as living true. They choose what is right, not what is popular. They keep their integrity, even when no one's watching. They keep going, not because someone cheers for them, but because something within won't let them stop. No more performing, no more trying to look good for others, no more carrying an image that weighs you down. That is when you live freely without permission. And that is also when you become unshakable. When you stop chasing applause, you begin to hear your own voice again. And you realize the stillness within is not a retreat. It is the foundation of truth. And truth doesn't need agreement. It only needs to be lived. There is a quiet, familiar kind of exhaustion that many people carry each day, the exhaustion of constantly adjusting yourself so others won't feel uncomfortable. The fatigue of trimming your thoughts, your words, your dreams just to keep the peace. But the real danger doesn't lie in the adjustment itself. The real danger is this. If you do it for too long, you start believing you don't deserve to live in your truth. I used to be the person who always tried to say things in a way that pleased everyone. I stayed within the safe zone. I softened my real feelings just so no one else would feel disturbed. But you know what? That's not love. That's compromise. And worse, it's a silent betrayal of yourself. The more you stay silent when you should speak, the more your voice begins to fade. The more you agree to things you don't believe in, the weaker your inner spine becomes. And over time, you stop seeing the line between respecting others and abandoning yourself to keep them comfortable. True freedom doesn't come when others understand you, agree with you, or applaud you. It comes when you no longer feel the need to bargain with your truth just to keep a relationship, a job, or a role. When you can look at a situation and say, I know this is true for me, and I will not abandon it even if no one else agrees. That is not easy, because truth makes people uncomfortable. Honesty can lead to being misunderstood. Boundaries can be called cold. But that's the price of freedom, and once you've lived without it, you'll know the cost of trading your truth for acceptance is far higher. You lose yourself, bit by bit, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the small compromises. You say, okay, when you should have said no. You smile when your soul is screaming. You live a life that no longer feels like yours just to hold on to a piece that isn't even real. But when you stop, when you decide to no longer negotiate not with your truth, not with your intuition, not with your core values, you become incredibly clear. The relationships that no longer fit start to dissolve. The blurry situations fade away. What once confused you now becomes transparent because you are no longer bargaining. You know what is true for you and you protect it quietly without announcement. People who live this way are not loud, but they are strong. They are not easily shaken by temporary emotions. They don't rush to react. They live slowly but steadily. They reject what isn't real not out of arrogance, but because they know the pain of having once betrayed themselves for things that were never worthy. When you stop negotiating your truth, you begin to rebuild your life on solid ground. A life with no more performing, no more pretending, no more censoring your feelings just to be approved. You no longer do things to be accepted. You do them because they are right. You don't live to be kept. You live to choose yourself every single day. And from there, true freedom begins. Not the short-lived freedom that comes from being accepted, but the lasting freedom that comes from no longer trading your truth for anything at all. True healing doesn't happen in warm hugs or sweet words of comfort. It doesn't come from an inspirational quote online or a weekend of spa self-care. True healing begins when you are completely alone. No one checking in. No one asking how you are. No noise. Just you and the wounds you've never named. This is the moment when there's no one left to blame. No one to lean on. No more busy work to hide behind. Everything goes quiet. And in that silence, you begin to see every unhealed cut, every pain you buried, every emotion you pushed aside just to keep performing the role of being okay. There's no one left to pretend for, no one to hold it together for. And that is the beginning of true healing when you stop avoiding yourself. You start sitting with the memories you've long brushed past. You recall the times you forgave too quickly, just to avoid being abandoned. The times you tried so hard to be good enough to be loved and were still overlooked. The wounds you once dismissed as not a big deal now rise with their full weight. No more hiding, no more excuses. And in that moment, the first thing you feel is not relief. It is pain, deep pain, because for the first time, you face the parts of yourself you've spent years denying: the hurt, the shame, the anger at yourself, for letting people cross your boundaries too many times while you stayed silent. But pain is not the end. Pain is the beginning. You no longer want to find someone to fill the void. Instead, you want to understand where that void came from. And then you stop trying to fill it. You sit with it. You observe it. You ask it where it came from. And you begin to heal it not with distractions, but with your own presence. You start rebuilding with small habits you once overlooked. Sleeping enough, eating well, moving your body, not to look good, but to feel strong. You journal not to record memories, but to strip down your emotions. You don't write to be understood. You write to understand yourself. You don't seek someone to dump your anger on. You learn to breathe through it. You stop blaming the past. You take responsibility for the present. And from these small acts, something begins to shift. You start to feel okay. Not the temporary kind of okay, but a deeper kind. You feel yourself returning. Not perfect, but present. Aware. Intentional. You no longer wait for someone to come fill the space. You no longer fear the silence. You begin to treasure it like a friend, because you've moved past the stage of needing someone to save you. You are the one healing. You are the one rebuilding, lowly, steadily, quietly, without an audience. And maybe the most beautiful part of healing in solitude is this: no one knows, but you know. No one sees, but you feel. No one applauds, but you carry it. And that is enough. Because for the first time, you don't need to be rescued. You've chosen to rise. You've chosen to return. And you are healing not with magic, but with courage. Not with noise, but with the quietest kind of honesty. After you've sat with your pain, after you've learned how to lift yourself up without anyone reaching out a hand, something new begins to rise inside you, not just a desire to heal, but to rebuild. Not to repair the old version of yourself, but to redesign your entire life. You no longer live in reaction. Now, you live by choice. Living alone in its fullest sense is not just about physical solitude. It is a quiet declaration. I will no longer let my life be programmed by someone else's pace expectations, or needs. I'm not retreating from the world. I'm simply unplugging for a moment to recalibrate my inner system. Because for too long, you lived by someone else's clock. You woke up to meet their schedule, ate by their timing, worked by their standards, smiled so they'd think you were okay, shrunk your dreams to preserve the relationship. But when you begin to live alone, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, you start adjusting everything. You no longer ask, what do people usually do? You ask, what truly makes me feel alive? And from there, you rebuild it all, from how you start your mornings, to how you speak to yourself, to how you use every minute of your life. Not to be perfect, but to be true. True to your values, true to your rhythm, true to the person you are becoming. This is not a makeover. This is a revolution. Quiet, steady, and extraordinary. Because it doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to be understood. It only needs one thing: you, a version of you that is committed to yourself, awake enough not to be pulled into someone else's life, and strong enough to say, this time, I will begin again my way. Living alone gives you absolute freedom, but it also demands the highest level of responsibility. Every decision is yours. No one left to blame, but also no one left to limit you. You begin to taste the kind of liberation that doesn't come from leaving someone, but from no longer letting anyone else write your script. No more asking, what should I do now? You know, you feel, you act, and you start to realize everything that once felt like a burden is actually an opportunity to choose again, an opportunity to redefine success, love, fulfillment, wholeness, yourself. Others may look at you and say, you've changed. And they're right, you have. Not because someone hurt you, but because you've grown tired of living a life that isn't yours. You're not rebelling, you're awakening. And you've chosen to step out of the old Cyclino announcement, no explanation. A personal revolution doesn't always come with fireworks. It unfolds in the smallest things, declining an invitation that doesn't feel right, unfollowing someone who drains your energy, deleting the texts that no longer need to be reread, waking up an hour earlier to read, to write, to focus, or simply learning to say no without guilt. And little by little, you build a new life, not loud, but solid, not seen, but intentional. You're no longer the one running from pain. You're the one rebuilding the foundation. And in that quiet, you become unshakable. In the end, what you've been searching for all along was never an achievement, not the look of approval, not the invisible medal someone hands you when you've done well enough. What your soul truly longs for is peace with yourself, a kind of peace no one can give you, one that only comes when you let go of the need to prove anything. There was a time when you thought you had to achieve something to be worthy, to overcome every wound, to heal quickly, to be okay again neatly, to show someone you were still standing. But when you are quiet enough, long enough, and honest enough with yourself, you realize there is nothing to prove, because everything you need to become, you've already carried within you. You don't need to become someone else. You just need to come home to yourself. True rebirth doesn't happen on a stage. It happens in quiet mornings when you make your own coffee and feel grateful to start again. It lives in the moments when you step outside, not to be seen, but simply to exist in a body no longer burdened by proving. It's in the quiet strength of saying no to a kind offer that isn't right for you and feeling no guilt. In the day, you choose to rest, not from exhaustion, but from self-respect. Rebirth is when you stop trying, not because you've given up, but because you realize there's nothing left to chase. You're no longer working to make someone proud, no longer trying to fit anyone's mold. You accept that some people will never understand you, some will leave, some things won't go your way, and you're still okay, because you no longer build your life on the foundation of agreement. You build it on truth. You move slower, clearer, with less noise. You no longer pour every emotion into the world like a cry for help. Now you hold it not to hide, but because you know not every feeling needs to be consumed. Some things just need to be felt, observed, breathed through, and released. You speak less, but every word is your own. You walk lighter, but with grounded steps. You show up not to impress, but to become a safe place for yourself, a person who no longer needs to perform, to be fine, to justify their silence in exchange for acceptance. A person whose quiet steadiness becomes the loudest declaration of all. And when others ask, "How have you changed?" you don't need to answer. They will see it in the space you protect without needing to explain, in the calmness when misunderstood without defending, in the clarity of your eyes when you say no. They will see that you've been reborn without announcement, because true power is not a scream. It is an unshakable silence. It is when you no longer need a platform to affirm your worth. You simply stand in your own 2 feet, on the foundation of truth you've lived, and the freedom you claimed with your own hands. And that's when you know you no longer live to be accepted. You live to be real. You don't need to be seen. You just need to be yourself. No performing, no hiding, no asking for permission. Just quietly present and whole. And if you've made it this far with me, I want you to know this. You are not alone on the journey back to yourself. Whether you are standing in the middle of a crowd or sitting in a quiet room, whether you are breaking or rebuilding, you can still begin again with one small decision, with one pause long enough to hear your own voice, with one courageous choice to stop living for acceptance and start living for truth. I'm not saying this path is easy, but I know without a doubt it is worth it. Because when you choose peace over noise, clarity over convenience, solitude over fitting and just to be yourself, you don't just survive. You are reborn. And little by little, your world begins to change. Not because you forced it to, but because you've changed from within. Thank you for spending this time, just to listen, but to truly receive, not just to understand, but to live honestly. I hope you keep choosing yourself even when no one else understands. I hope you protect the stillness in your heart, even when the world outside is loud. And most of all, I hope you always remember this peace is a choice, and you deserve to choose it. I wish you strength. I wish you resilience to keep moving forward, and softness, so you never lose yourself along the way. I wish you peace, deep, quiet, and true.